I'm Darryl Cross, and I'm an executive and personal coach. And in much of the coaching that I do, people frequently want to know how they can find more hours in the day. How can they find more time? And my response to that is basically they won't be able to find any more time. They have the same amount of time as we all do. It's called 168 hours in the week. And I remind them they have the same amount of time as Mother Teresa had, as Einstein had, as Nelson Mandela has, and so on. And so it's more a question of not so much how I can find time as what can I do with the time I already have. So it's really a matter of priorities. And I really like the work by Stephen Covey. And Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and then in his subsequent text, First Things First, talked about a paradigm where he divided time into 2 sectors. He divided time into that which is urgent and not urgent, and he divided time into that which is important and not important. And when you do that, you can then work out a quadrant of how you can parcel time. So, for example, if I pursue that a bit further, what Covey says that if time is really urgent and important, then the sorts of things we have in this quadrant here are crises. And we would all say yes to that. There are lots of those in the workplace. We would have deadlines, things that have to be done by a particular time. We often have meetings and activities occurring there that are really important and that are also have an urgency attached to them. And most of our work life seems to be in that particular quadrant, where things seem to be both urgent and important. But he also says there's a quadrant of what he called deception, and it's quadrant 3. This quadrant of deception, he says, things feign being urgent, but they're really not important at all. And he says, for example, there are things like interruptions. There are things like emails. There are things like some meetings and some projects. In this quadrant, he's really saying they're not really important, but they might be urgent. But they do take a good deal of our time, and we get deceived. We get deceived that they are actually important and they're not really. And so it might be the phantom quadrant, or it might be the quadrant of deception. We get deceived, and much of our time gets taken up in lots of these activities that are not really critical in the way that we might presume that they are. However, he says there are some other quadrants that we need to consider. And this one here, where it's not urgent, but it is important. In fact, Covey argues that it's vitally important, it's critically important. And in here, we have things like planning. In here, we have where we undertake activities, where we have empowerment. In here might be recreation. It's being creative. It might be in here forming strategy. But it means that this is absolutely critical, but it's not urgent. It's not urgent at all. The 4th quadrant down here is the quadrant he suggests is the escape quadrant. And there are things in here that are trivial matters. It might be surfing the net. It might be in here that we're actually wasting time and we're actually escaping various activities that we ought to be doing. We might be just handling spam emails or even pursuing them. We might be just gossiping over the water cooler or the photocopier. We might even just be going out and grabbing a cup of coffee and reading the paper, and in a sense, wasting our time. And interestingly enough, he argues, and quite rightly so, that if we spend too much time in quadrant 1 with too many crises, we often escape over here to the trivia and in order to try to preserve our sanity. And by the way, if you spend too much time in quadrant 4, rightly you'll probably be fired or asked to move along, because over here you're not being productive at all. Now, as we look at that, one of the things that I think is really critical to understand here is, even though we might spend most of our time in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, what would you consider was the most important quadrant? And most people say, oh, quadrant 1, because you've really got to deal with things. But as you look at this paradigm, the most important quadrant in terms of managing time is, in fact, this quadrant 2 in here. This is absolutely critical, because in here is our planning and our strategy time. And it is absolutely mandatory that we find time each day, and certainly each week, to put aside in our diary some planning time. That might be an hour, it might be half an hour a day. And lots of people say to me, I can't find that time. And my response to that is, if you don't find that time and you spend all of your time over here in quadrant 1 dealing with crises, then the good Lord or the universe or whatever you believe is going to come along, and you're going to have a breakdown, and you are going to be having forced time. And so I suggest to people that they ought to make sure that right now that they actually start to control their diaries and put in their planning time where they can actually think. Time out, space to think and plan. And if they do that, if they spend more time in this particular quadrant, people end up spending less time in quadrant 1 and certainly less time in quadrant 3. And that's what prioritising your time is all about. Creating a time out where you can think and plan your life and get more control of your life, rather than life being dictated by quadrant 1 and 3. And in the end, us escaping to quadrant 4. So my challenge to you is to ask, how can you find more quadrant 2 time? What would it take for you to find that time? What would you do? Where would you go? Maybe you could just start with 10 minutes a day, finding that quadrant 2 time. But ultimately, it's absolutely critical to put that into your diary, because it is a road to sanity when you do that.